It's a song about it. It's the PT anthem.
Rest, ice, compress, elevate.
What?
Rest, ice, compress, elevate.
Ice.
Rest, ice, compress, elevate. Every day we ricin', weekend plans we ricin'. We do so much ricin', we could have our PT license. So if you're feeling naughty, foam roll that body. Don't need Kanye's workout plan, got 1 pound weights and rubber bands. Make sure, engage your core, building up that pelvic floor. Thrust it up, hips align, and if it hurts, then modify. Stop, drop it low, but pick it up carefully. Work them glutes like you in physical therapy. Started when I reached for my bottom drawer. I felt the pain I ain't never felt before. I went on one hike, I tore my meniscus.